So the next talk is called PAL in a Pandemic, and we've got 4 speakers for this, so, or rather four names here, and I'm worried that there's 3 people waiting in the wings I'm not expecting. But shall I just introduce Jessica, because I can see Jessica Hargreaves is ready to go. So Jessica, please take it away.
Yeah, there's 4 of us that have contributed, but one of us couldn't make it today, so one of us is going to be both people, so you'll see when it comes up. Okay, hopefully I've shared my screen. Can we see that?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you very much. PAL in a pandemic. We hope that's a phrase that we aren't going to hear again. My name is Sue Russell. I'm from the University of York, and I work with Jessica Hargreaves in maths. During the presentation, we're going to give an overview and evaluation of PAL in Sheffield Hallam University and also the University of York. We'll share our takeaways, so the things that we would keep from PAL in a pandemic. So peer-assisted learning in the UK is based on SHU, which is quite a mouthful. So supplemental instruction, peer-assisted study sessions. And it was developed in the 1970s as a collaborative learning model. And studies show that PAL schemes can increase student involvement in their own learning, provide a community, departmental community, and improve attainment. And typically it's run in a difficult module. PAL leaders volunteer for the roles, and they're higher year students who facilitate sessions for lower year students in, like I say, typically a difficult module. And so the sessions are very much designed by students for students. And they're not just for students that are struggling, but they're for all students. And if you get a wider range of students on the sessions, the better it is. And for the 3 schemes, they were online in 2020, 2021, and optional timetabled sessions. So in terms of training, across the PAL schemes in the university, they do a SHU equivalent training, which talks about the structure of a session, types of questions that they might ask the students on the PAL sessions, and then any exploration of scenarios. So what happens if the PAL leaders don't know the answer to a particular question? What happens if there's a student that is taking over the session, or any other challenging group dynamics? And then we also did a subject specific, so in this case for maths and statistics, I gave them some online training based on different things like Zoom and breakout rooms and online tools, which we'll talk about in the 3 case studies.
Thanks, Sue. Okay, so I'm just going to give an overview of the 3 different case studies before we go into a bit more detail on each. So PAL at Sheffield Hallam started in 2008-09. It was introduced to help with the transition into university and basically build relationships, or help cement relationships in the first year. It's students from later years that support groups of first years to undertake a project. It is assessed, but it's not attached to a particular module. In 2019-20, I tried to replicate this a bit with the first year probability and stats module that I run, which students quite often struggle with. So we introduced it initially as more like a drop-in, so similar to stat support really. So students first years could drop in and speak to one of the second year tutors that was helping out. Now, for both of these, when we went online, we used Zoom this year, but there were some issues that meant one of us had to be there. So normally Claire and myself would not be present at these sessions, but we had to kind of be there as more of a staff receptionist, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail just now, in a minute. Then moving on to Jess's case study that she will talk about. So Jess and Sue developed a brand new one this year. So it was developed specifically for remote online learning. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words. It was developed specifically for remote delivery. And that is similar to mine. It's again linked to the first year probability and stats module, but it's much more structured. So the more of the traditional PAL running. So the original, this is the Sheffield Hallam PAL groups face-to-face, so as it should be. Now Claire does a really good job of doing the training that Sue's already discussed with the PAL leaders at the beginning. She does incorporate the techniques and tools into the training workshop that they are suggested to use when they actually do the PAL sessions. They also get a bit of extra support from PAL supervisors, so traditionally third year students who offer additional support. So this year, the main changes, as I said, Claire had to be present as a kind of receptionist in the Zoom room, because when you walk into a normal room, you just go over to the table. In a Zoom room, there might be no one there. It's a bit off-putting. So initially, both of us would have to act as a kind of receptionist, putting them into rooms. What Claire did say, though, is that she quite enjoyed the fact she was interacting more with the leaders and getting a lot more feedback. And then that's something she'd like to kind of keep going. I'm just going to talk briefly as well about some of the techniques or tools that Claire used to replicate. So she tried to basically replicate everything, all the techniques that she used face-to-face, online, of what worked. Sorry, I'm waiting for Jessica to move the thing. Yes, thank you. So traditionally they meet at Mat Arcade, which has board games, but she had electronic games. There were virtual whiteboards, for example, replacing others. And the one I want to discuss most is the use of Google Docs. And this is because it's something that we'll probably take forward. I've used it as well in my teaching, and I think it's very useful. So it's enabling students to get started with discussion. So you give them a Google Doc to fill in. Each group has a different space. It does allow the lecturer to see what each group is doing without interrupting, and it gives a permanent record. So this is definitely one of the things that we'll probably keep going forward. So evaluation, we did attempt to collect quantitative data for both this one and the stats one, not very successfully, with very few students responding, but Sue was kind enough to do some interviews with some of our supervisors. So the comments that you'll see on the slides, the evaluation slides, are generally from the PAL supervisors. So one of the major benefits this year was that this year students really struggled to make friends and talk to each other. And I think the PAL, followed by the peer support in stats, really enabled them to sort of bond a bit more and be able to talk to higher year students. So this is a definite plus this year. But obviously it's a lot harder to deliver online. Easier to attend, you just sort of turn up, but more difficult because you've got to try and think of new ways of doing things that you wouldn't have to normally. And it took more time, so it takes more time than normal. So for this particular PAL scheme, it will revert totally to being in person, but some of the elements will be kept, for example, things like Google Docs or more interaction between staff and PAL leaders. So I'm not going to talk too long about mine because I didn't make too many adaptations, to be honest, and it's very similar to Claire's. But essentially it was introduced because students are struggling with stats understanding. They also have to do programming in SAS and they have to do reporting. So the PAL support tutors help them with all of those aspects, similar to stat support. Last year it wasn't very popular, not many people turned up. So this year we focused it more on the work-based group projects, so similar to the original PAL, and that has increased in attendance. We also extended it to second years because they had a lot of disruption to their learning last year and they couldn't support themselves. So the same tutors as the previous year carried on with me. So I did get 6 whole people filling in a survey, and 5 of those 6 said the peer support improved their confidence, understanding of stats, and made them more comfortable asking for help. And in the general end of module feedback, one student gave this comment that the module, they felt it was the module that was most supported. Okay, finally, some evaluations. So these are comments from one of my tutors who did both. So what he says is very similar to what I found in stat support. So it is good for the fact that you can just turn up, or you don't have to physically go anywhere, so it's time that saves time. But there were often issues with technology, particularly if we're trying to deal with different computing packages, etc., screen sharing, and that holds it up. It does take a lot more time. But one of the benefits was that it did give students a regular place to meet. So by regular space, I mean that they normally, in working in groups, they'd have to find a physical space. And then one of the benefits here was that they could come to a certain room from wherever they were, and it gave them that space, which is something I'll probably try and keep. Attendance was better. Next year, I was going to do online drop-in because it's more convenient, but I'm going to have to evaluate it early on to see whether it's actually worth keeping it totally online. Okay, Jess.
So case study 3 was at the University of York, and like case study 2, it was embedded in the probability and statistics module. But unlike the other two, as we've said earlier, this one came into being during the pandemic, so it's only ever been delivered online. So when we say embedded within a module, the idea is this is advertised to students as saying your provision for this module is you've got lectures, you've got seminars, and you've also got PAL sessions for this module. And we explain it to the students as saying this is like a seminar, but run by students for students. And we thought of it this year as a place where the students could ask questions about the module and university life in general, and prepare for the following seminar that would be with a member of staff. So on a week-to-week basis, we had a PAL debrief session. This was with the PAL leaders, the module lead, which is myself, and Sue from the central PAL team. And at that session, we would reflect on the previous session and then work together to plan the next session. So this collaborative approach, very much of the students as partners model. The actual sessions themselves were split into 3 parts. And the idea is, I very much thought of this in the same way I'd approach a seminar. So you have something prepared, so you can see point 3 there is some activity that you've prepared, but I would always, in my teaching, make sure that there's an opportunity for the students to ask any questions they have, so that you are adapting it to what the students' needs are. So in a similar manner, but run by students. So the first things we had was a drop-in, which the PAL leaders labelled as ask us anything. I think they meant anything. So it was about the module, any other module, university life in general. I've no idea what was asked there, because what happens in PAL stays in PAL. But I know that a lot of the students found that really useful. The next thing we did was legal hints. So this was tips for the piece of work that we had to hand in that week, approved by the lecturer. Of course, most of the things they were asking in the drop-in was about the assessed piece of work. However, by making it very clear that it's part of the session, the idea was that it would advertise that to the first year students, so they would see a benefit of attending, that they might get some inside information on an assessment. And we all know when things are linked to assessment, numbers tend to increase. The final part would be the main piece of the session, which would be an interactive pre-planned activity. And with PAL sessions especially, the idea is that it's interactive, it's collaborative. So because we were designing these sessions online, we used all the tools that I'm sure you're familiar with, and I think lots of people are going to talk about today. In terms of evaluating the scheme, the overwhelming feeling was that it was a success. The key principles of PAL, as we've already said, is about this building a community, and to build that community, taking part in collaborative, active learning. So everybody felt that delivering PAL was particularly challenging this year in the circumstances that we find ourselves in, but particularly necessary this year in the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And everybody involved felt that they'd benefited from it in some way, especially lots of comments about building community and meeting people, like Ellen's already mentioned. So we're in a bit of a strange position at the moment, because it's a bit like we were last year, when you're thinking, okay, I've got to do something in a different way to how I did it before, but we've sort of got the option. Do we totally change it and do it a completely different way, or do we stick with what we've got? At the moment, we think a bit similar to Ellen, we're going to retain that 3-part structure that we discussed, but we will transition those sessions to being in person when we're allowed. Because like we said, the key aspects of PAL, the building the community, the interactivity, everybody felt, or the majority felt, that worked better face to face. However, those first two things, the drop in and the getting the hints for the coursework, do work well in an online setting. It's not that difficult to transition those things. They do retain the sort of essential features of that kind of session. So we'll also hold a weekly PAL drop-in / Q&A session for the reasons that, as you can see there, them say it's making it easier for themselves and for the PAL leaders to attend that. And also you can ask things anonymously, or so that at least anonymous to your other students, and a lot of students saying that they really appreciated that aspect too. And finally, I think we all kind of learn about technology enhanced learning and think about using it, but this experience has really brought home the value of that for this way of communicating anonymously within a session. So moving forward in our in-person sessions, we'll embed that sort of technology that we've experienced, because staff and students this year have been exposed to things they wouldn't have normally been exposed to. So hopefully that will land a little bit easier next year. So to bring everything together, what have we learned from all of these case studies? Well, I think the general sense is that the key principles of developing a community and having interactive activities generally are preferred in person, but it's not all bad. There are benefits to online provision, such as flexibility, being able to be anonymous if you want to, and so therefore it makes those things in a way more inclusive. So interestingly, for the 2 PAL schemes that are embedded in a module that do have this reason of wanting a drop-in kind of Q&A session, they will continue to learn to keep that provision. And in fact, I think I might do a similar thing in my modules as well. I might have an online drop-in kind of session to ask questions. And then finally, as we've seen, the experience of using online tools has in some ways made us think, oh, this is an equivalent thing to what we'd have done in person, but we like how it works online better, like the Google Doc example from Ellen earlier. Or like we've said, it's really been a refresher of how useful these technology enhanced learning techniques can be. And thank you for listening. Please do, I think we've got a few minutes if you want to ask us any questions.
Indeed, thank you very much. It's a quick round of applause. There are ways, I believe, of giving some reactions. I can't remember where they are on this. It's a different way, different way of doing it. So do we have any more questions? I know we've got one at Jessica. It says, how many students were there per session?
This is Ellen alluded to this a little bit. So it tended to be, in a typical session, we tended to get 10 to 20, and there's 200 students enrolled on the module, for mine anyway. But that's fairly typical, as far as I can tell, PAL sort of uptake numbers. However, in the final week, we organised a PALathon where we had a monster session where they revised the whole module, and that really made me think about saying they're going to give you their inside tips on taking exams, and of course they were online exams this year, so tips about online exams as well, and that was phenomenally attended. I think we got something like 50 students to that. So yeah, there are our attendance numbers. I think you talked about attendance numbers, Ellen, didn't you, a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, for Claire's PAL, it's kind of compulsory. So their attendance is going to be better there, but not perfect. For mine, yeah, we had very few people in the first year. This year we did have more, but like I said, it was tied more to, they work on work-based learning projects, which they get more support with anyway, and they were being helped directly with that. So I think that increased attendance to 50% of students at some points. I think more than 50% of students at some points came, but also because it was this, I build it as like, this is a place you can work together and get support if you need it, as opposed to having to ask questions.
I think there's always, with these PAL schemes, there's always a range of students, and I find there's certain students who just want to hear from the lecturer, and so you're never going to get those people going to it. But yeah, this year I think even those students really would have benefited, of course, from coming along and building some communities. But yeah, I think that's why the numbers tend to be not 100%, because it's not quite for everybody, but very useful to those that do require that kind of interactions.
Yeah, indeed, the number's never 100%.
Well, in anything, is it? And I get upset about lectures.
Yeah, lectures and things. Okay, well, great. Thanks so much. If anybody's got any more questions, can they stick them in the chat, and make sure you target them at the right person, so we know who they're for. So thank you very much, Jessica, Sue, and Ellen. And Claire Cornock was somewhere in spirit. So yes.